Well, we're going to get started because most of you have heard this part. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. It's October 14th, the day after my husband's birthday. So what a great way to start the month. And October is one of my favorite months because we have Halloween, but we are a little bit far away from that to do a Halloween themed British Empire Study Group. So as most of you know, the British Empire Study Group is co-chaired by myself and Bob Gray. Bob Gray had another commitment tonight, so we have invited Roger Brody, who should be familiar to most of you from the Collectors Club and many other things, to join us tonight, and he is a friend of the British Empire Study Group. So you'll enjoy him. So Robert usually goes through this parts, but we'll do the best I can. The British Empire Study Group is pretty much a very social group. We usually meet at the Collectors Club in Manhattan, and we get together. We have great meals, great drinks, and talk philately. You know who started stamps? That's John Gray, no relation to Robert. British Empire Study Group, as you know, we are very liberal with the term British Empire Study Group. If you flew over the British Empire, we'll bring it in for a talk. Okay, so we go into what is philately. Philately for us is more than just stamps and albums. It's really a lot about the social philately and the stories behind philately. Some of the technical parts are very interesting in the research, but we try to get a more general view of philately because it really has some great reach into all parts of society. So our next meeting is going to be on Zoom on November 11th, which is Veterans Day. It's by Ken Plow, and it's going to be really cool. It's on propaganda stamps and espionage currency, pretty appropriate for Veterans Day. And hopefully, I haven't had a confirmation from him, but we were supposed to have Sergeant Major Herbert Friedman join us. So a couple of housekeeping things, questions and answers. Please put them in the Q&A button. It's right there in the center of the screen. Following this presentation, there'll be the normal social hour where we'll bring you all over and you could put on your cameras, put on your mics and ask some questions. Kathy will be here to answer some of the questions, say hello. At the bottom of the screen, you may see some closed captions. For those of you who have a bit of trouble hearing, they're very useful. Some other people might find them obnoxious. To turn them off, if you look at the bottom of your screen and you pull up your control panel, you should see a hide transcript or live transcript, might be CC. Click on that and hit hide subtitles, and then you won't see those things. And you won't, if you ever need to reboot them, you'll have to reboot them in your next meeting, but that should make them go away. If you're interested in a topic, we are planning our next year's program. We have some pretty interesting things lined up, and I'm not going to tell you about them right now because I'm going to keep you coming back. So at this point in time, I am going to turn it over to Mr. Brody to introduce our speaker.
Kathryn Johnson is a prolific exhibitor and an accredited APS judge, currently serving on the CanEdge board. She is a former APS treasurer and director at large. Her collecting interests are focused mainly on the British Commonwealth, Ceylon, Mauritius, Scotland, and Canada, and more recently, a few US topics. She is a member of the Collectors Club of Chicago, the Royal Philatelic Society of London, the Collectors Club, currently serving as a governor, and the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors, where she serves as vice president. For her numerous and meritorious contributions to the American Philatelic Society, in 2019, Kathy received the John N. Luff Award for outstanding service to the APS. On a personal note, Kathy assisted me in discovering the amazing triple rate cover from Galley Ceylon to Hong Kong for my dream cover exhibit. at the 2020 Collectors Club One Frame Competition. This amazing cover was recently featured in the 2021 Congress book. It is both a pleasure and an honor to introduce this evening's presenter, Kathryn Johnson.
Roger, you spoil me with all that. That's so nice. Well,
I only speak truth. I only speak truth.
Very kind of you, Roger. Thank you. Appreciate you introducing me. And I know Joan's still working on the slide thing, and that's just fine because I wanted to just kind of briefly introduce the topic of these Scotland halfpenny marks because they're really about a lot more than just Scottish mail. They're about a lot of international mail that that we all see because so many things went to and from Scotland in the early, stampless period. So much of this mail that people collect for all different reasons, like Cape of Good Hope collector, an Australia collector, New Zealand collector, India collector, my heart and soul Ceylon. I knew these halfpenny marks from my Ceylon collecting. So, I got interested in them when I started getting serious about Scotland philately. And I like Scotland philately because the Scots migrated so very much. I'll start in on my slides, but I did want to give that brief introduction to say that these halfpenny mail coach tax markings, a whole lot of us see these markings, don't really know what to make of them. And so I thought this talk might just be helpful for people to just have a sense of what these markings were, to be able to say a little bit more about them when they're describing a cover, perhaps putting in an exhibit or selling a cover or something, to just be able to say a little bit more about the markings. So I'll hit share and we'll start in on my slide deck. And look at that, they went up like a pro. Okay, so Scotland's halfpenny mail coach tax, like I said, but I wanted to highlight this. This is a really short window. It's 1813 to 1839. And you're going to understand why it goes only to 1839, but in 1813 was the beginning of this tax. So it's at 1840 that we begin, of course, the penny post. And at that time, this halfpenny was gone. It was actually gone in late 1839. This marking, really what it's about is any cover that's going to go across a toll road, of which there were mostly the main arteries to and from Scotland were the toll roads, became the toll roads. Any cover, any piece of mail that's going to cut across those is going to be subject to the halfpenny marking. And that's when it went across it in a mail coach. If it went across it with a footpost or with like a horse carriage, it wouldn't be. But if it was in a if the letter was in a mail coach, and it was on one of the toll roads, it was subject to the tax. And that is most of the mail. And we'll get into where the tax was and where the tax wasn't, but mostly if it's Scottish mail from 1813 to 1839, it's going to have that marking. The interesting thing is going to be where was the marking applied and why and how might it have been used to collect the tax. And generally the short answer is only once. A cover is moving, it will only be subject to that tax once. Okay, so of course, when we have a talk about stamps, it's really nice to look at some pretty covers. And this is just a typical example of an early additional halfpenny marking. And what I like about this whole topic is that a halfpenny is a small amount, but the marking is bigger than the rate marking. So up there, you're going to see that squiggle, which is a 7, and then an additional ADDL dot additional half. So it's 7.5. And this is an internal Scottish letter going, sent within Scotland to a small Scottish town. But that's just a very typical letter. And I think they're really attractive. Some of the other, the halfpenny markings over time, they're kind of nothing. But these early ones, they're really something. There's something to look at. There's something to wonder about. The 2 is exciting. They're just really a neat marking. And that's what kind of caught my attention and made me want to collect them. So for you, with this talk, I want to help make you look smart because we're going to talk about the transatlantic, covers that have these markings. And you're going to know when you're looking at a cover that you want to know where that marking was applied. And you want to know some of the other things about it, like an indication on a cover that says N Britain. I used to see that N Britain and I didn't understand it, but N Britain, maybe you guys all know this, but N Britain means Scotland, North Britain. generally ship mail came in to the first port. And that was what the ships were to do. Is they're coming to England, they get to the first port they can get to and offload that mail. You'll see routing on covers that goes from the port to London. And a lot of times in London, that first mark went on. So these halfpenny marks, you might think were all applied in Scotland since it's a Scottish tax, but many of them were applied in London as the cover is going to be routed up the toll road into Scotland. So, and I also am going to make some comments about the rate markings that are on the covers, because there's a lot of, it looks to be scribbles on the covers. And at your first glance, you might think that an error was made in the rating, but actually it's subsequent ratings. So a cover comes in as a ship letter subject to, 8 pence as a ship letter, but then there'll be a rating to go from that port, say Liverpool to London, that's going to be an additional amount. So it might be the 8 plus that additional amount that are marked on there. Then in London, it's getting rated to its onward location in Scotland. So you can see 2 crossed off ratings and a 3rd rating, none of which are an error. They're just the way a cover was rated onward. So the first 8D, the 2nd rating to London, the 3rd rating up to Scotland, and the half D rating all together, all those indications are needed to really appropriately rate a cover. And you'll look smart when you can kind of, take apart a cover's squiggly marks, make some sense of them as rating marks, and not describe them as mistakes. They're just the way it was onward rated to get to final destination. It's often a helpful little cheat sheet that all those squiggles are there on the covers, because it helps you identify the port it came into, because all of this rating had to do with distance. So I was just mentioning that, and here's a little diagram. This is just a copy of a page from an exhibit of mine, and this map for a bunch of you might be familiar because it comes from one of the books I think all of us have dog-eared, but that helps us rate the covers. So I had made like a little cheat sheet for myself years ago that had the rates per sheet by distance on the one side, the indication of mail coach, horse post, and water routes, and just some little sample arrows to just help draw the path. I think a lot of times when you're trying to rate covers, a lot of it just is helped by grabbing a map, by just looking at what port would this mail have likely come in if it was coming, from the Far East. Where would it have likely come in? How did it get to London? How did it get from London onto its onward destination? And when you look at the map, you can kind of respect why it costs so much to take the mail. The Scottish mail costs so much more than the British mail, but it had to go through some very harsh geography, rough roads under constant repair. And that's how we get into this whole mail tax. So here's a cover with a bunch of squiggly marks that a lot of people don't like to deal with, but all it's saying is 1 shilling 2.5 D unpaid. So I'm just going to say that a cheat sheet like that is really helpful, and that I keep that map when I'm working on covers. I keep a map out, and it just helps me a lot. So since I just described, 1 shilling 2.5 as the rate, you could easily question, why was that half D marking so large? And the reason it was so large was that the post office wanted to make sure it was collected. Let's go back and remember that most mail was sent unpaid and the recipient paid for the mail. So an unpaid letter comes in. Now, of course, some of them were paid, but if it's in black ink, and it's most of them, they're unpaid. So it comes in, it gets rated, it gets onward rated at a city like London to make it up to Scotland. And that half D strike was put on most likely in London, sometimes in Scotland, but at the first opportunity it was put on. And the reason the post office really wanted to make sure it was collected was because it was new. In 1813 it was new, because nobody likes a tax, and because the post office had gotten themselves in this position of kind of needing to pay back the private owners of these roads to use the roads, because the mail coaches themselves were putting a lot of damage to the roadways. And once they agreed to pay this £5,000, a big number, they wanted to recover it. And they wanted to recover it through the collecting of this tax, which ended up being just one big old cumbersome, ugly matter that all went away in 1839 when we were working towards our penny post, but when we were in the 4D post beforehand. So the marking was large because they wanted to make sure they didn't miss it. They wanted to make sure they collected it. And because mail was sent unpaid, this was something to be paid by the recipient. Okay, so here comes another slide. So it's not just Scotland. The markings were put on in England, like I said, but they were also put in Ireland. If the letters, some letters would, come into Ireland as their first point and then go on to Scotland. So, there aren't too many cities in Ireland, but there's a few, but Dublin's the one you're going to see. So this happens to be a letter from London to Lauder, but I just want to make the point that Ireland is in this story too. And you see this marking. I picked this one on purpose, that it's not perfectly struck. I mean, it's neatly struck, but it's not perfectly struck. A part of it's over the top, and it wouldn't have mattered. One of the things that we have to kind of adjust our thinking to, especially if we've been collecting more modern mail, is that these are folded letters. They're not always perfectly flat. They're on a very good, heavy linen stock. But what was important was conveying that this half needed to be collected. It wasn't important that it be a pretty strike. It was important that it be not missed. So a bunch of the strikes look like this. So it's interesting in Markophily when you can get yourself really excited about perfect strikes, to recognize what those strikes are hitting and whether or not it's about the marking or the surface it's going on, or the nature and importance of the marking. For a lot of our date stamps, what's important is the accountability, that the operator wanted to say, we got it here and we got it out of here, and it went on to this next city, and they want that date strike to be very clear. In this case, they want it to be clear that a half penny is to be collected, but that the additional part is a little bit missing. Doesn't matter. They just want that strike to be on there. So I put in this little slide about a perspective on the halfpenny tax. The big point I'd like to make is that the cost of the mail was very high. Many of these letters cost a shilling or so to send. If it was coming in from a port, going through London and getting up to Scotland, it was expensive. And I don't know if any of you might remember that song, "If you have no penny, a halfpenny will do. If you have no halfpenny, then God bless you." Well, it was a Charles Dickens, David Copperfield song, and what it was about was saying the difference between happiness and misery was a half a shilling. That was the amount that was left over from a week's wages. So the reason I'm bringing that up is to say the half penny is significant, but what's really significant is the cost of mail. And for the average working person, they weren't communicating through the mail until we get to the penny post times. In these early 1830s, late 1700s, the mail was generally legal and business, and very rarely was it personal correspondence. In my collecting, I love to find personal correspondence letters because oftentimes they're beautiful life stories. That there'll be, somebody that went over to Canada, and here I'm digressing, but they went over to Canada and they've got 6 people writing in this same letter, putting a little bit, Aunt May says this, and so says that, and God bless you, and all this stuff, but they'll pack it into one letter because a number of people are into this correspondence that's going over to a loved one. But there's not a lot of that mail until you get to 1840. Most of the mail, sadly with Scotland, most of the mail is legal, having to do with unpaid debts. And banking mail, missionary things, and then things that went free of post. So I've got a little thing here that says the mindset and economics of the times. The Industrial Revolution letter was just too expensive for most people to send, but life was tough all the way around. Mail was just one very minor point. But what this put into place was a lot of Scots kind of what they call voting with their feet, and migrating to other lands, which we get to enjoy in postal history because we see their mail. And I've really enjoyed collecting the mail, the Scottish mail that's gone around the world, because it's very interesting from a rate standpoint, and there's a lot of it, and it's just neat to look at. So, whoops, now I get to use the backspace. So what's this mail tax about? So the background is that Scotland really is on some very hideous land. Bad weather, tough roads. These were rocky old roads that were put, segments were put together by individual landowners, and they created what was called a turnpike trust. And they collected, just like toll roads that we have today, they collected at different spots along the way. And this trust kind of came together and worked with the post office to create a system that allowed the mail to go through paying, instead of being exempt and just kind of ripping these people off, paying them this 5,000 pounds I mentioned as a yearly amount, for the privilege of using the mail coaches on these roads. But keeping these roads up was tough. And a lot of the problem was the mail coaches, because they were heavy, they were carrying mail, but what they were carrying that was really kind of the crux of the matter was the newspapers. Newspapers were heavy, they were big. When you buy one of these, old 1830s newspapers on eBay and it comes in the mail, you're like, very surprising that the paper stock is so heavy, that these old newspapers were so big and thick. And this whole situation of the mail coming up to Scotland was complicated. It was difficult. The roads were poor. They were hilly. The weather was atrocious, and it was just trouble. And that's what all of this whole hefty tax has to do with, was road conditions and just trying to kind of make the numbers work. And how was the tax applied? The letters were charged by distance. If the mail crossed from Scotland to England or from England to Scotland, if it went on the tollway, which nearly everything did, the tax was added and paid by the recipient. So the burden was really to the recipient of the mail, and it really applied to most letters. There's a bunch of little border towns along that did not have to go on the tollway, but pretty much mail that went to Edinburgh as a cross point to then go outward to other Scottish towns for sure went on this tollway and was for sure subject to the hefty mail tax. So what was taxed and what wasn't taxed? If it's a letter, it was taxed. If it's an oversized letter, a triple rate, quadruple rate, still a single charge. Redirected letters, still a single charge. Foreign letters that came in through these ship ports, like I was talking about, still a single charge. And how did the mail move? I've talked about this a little bit, but it's just kind of helpful to just get back and look at a map once in a while and just see. There's a lot of Scotland up there. And all of that mail is, the ports, you're not going to see me pointing at this, but if you know that London's to the lower end and a lot of that mail is coming up the channel, it's going to come into London or some of these southern ports, and it's going to have to make its way across England up through Scotland. And that is why we end up with so much of it having this hefty charge. Here's a ship letter. And when I was talking about the squiggles, this is perfect example of the squiggles. So I don't know if you can kind of wrap your head around, there's a swirly 8 there, right above that bad looking half-D stamp. There's a boxed half-D marking missing the top of its box. So typical, so very typical of what these things are. It's enough there that anybody rating and collecting the fee on the other end is going to know it says a half. What you're seeing first is one squiggle that's the 8D ship letter. Then you're seeing a 9D port to London and a 1 shilling 1 London to Edinburgh. All of that's on there to make a total of 2.6. The 2.6 is above that ridiculously good looking Cape of Good Hope General Post Office marking. Like you fall in love with Markophily when you see markings like that. You don't fall in love with it for that lousy looking half-D marking, but I wanted to show you that to show you that they didn't care. They just needed you to see something was there that meant a half-D. And this one's a little later. This is 1835, not 1813. And the markings have gotten a little smaller. Kind of like everyone got the idea, but oh, hey, don't forget to collect it. That's the point. So this is what you get into rating these letters. And you could think that's a bunch of stuff being crossed off, but it's really onward rating. And that's what's kind of good about taking a close look at rate markings and just trying to figure them out. What's good to do with them is to just think it's all correct and step yourself through it, just step by step. It's going to come into a port. It's probably going to go to London. It's going to go on to an onward city, probably in Edinburgh, maybe onward from there, and just kind of step through your markings. And sometimes the cross off indicators are really obvious. Sometimes they aren't, but you can just kind of figure it out and step through it. And that's what I was hoping I could help with this talk, was to just say, these things are kind of interesting. It's nice to put a cover in front of yourself, open up a map and just look at it a little bit and see if you can noodle your way through it. Here's another one. This one's just an in-country example. This is a Hamilton, you know, nice normal town to be seeing of Scottish mail. And we're going from Edinburgh to Hamilton. It cost 8D to go there and an additional half. It's a smaller marking. It's very clear. It happens to be very clear partly because there's a few different reasons why your markings might be nice and clear. One is a conscientious postal clerk. One is a brand new marking and nice ink. Another is just the quality and the folding of the paper. And this one is just a tidy little small cover, not something, you know, heavily folded. And so it received a nice, neat strike. I love this strike. I don't know why this just appeals to me so much. It's just such a clean, normal looking mark. I'm going to get into how you look all these things up, but the characteristic of the mark is one of your first things, and the town to and from is the next thing. Where was it struck to say that this was going to go on the toll road and would need the halfpence collected from the recipient? As we get on to the 1830s, the marks are getting smaller. A lot of times they're clean, but they're just smaller. Here's a small one applied in London. And note this has got a little red star. The red star is an inspector's mark, which was a cross check on the rate. And you'll see a lot of those. And that's what they're about. The rate marking is up there by the addressee's name, and you can see it all squiggled in there. And it's 1 shilling 1 plus 1/2. So I'd mentioned the markings. I think these are they've moved a little in their boxes. They're jumping around. But at the very beginning, there's your boxed additional half marking. And that 2, that's a great looking 2 down there. There's a bunch of different 2s. They don't all look the same. They give you a little hint as to where they're from. But there's a few in London and there's a few in Edinburgh. And you can usually work your way through it based on the cover and what, you know, it's a folded letter, so you're going to have some information on the inside about it. But there's your additional half 2, the really large markings at the beginning of time. Then you have some unboxed markings, and I've showed you an example of that. Some simple boxed markings and some, you know, unboxed that say additional half, and then some boxed and unboxed that are just the fraction. The slope of the line of the fraction varies, and that's one of the descriptors as to whether it's, you know, a straight out horizontal or if it's shifted, you know, left or right. What I really got interested in when I was putting together an exhibit of this wasn't to have one from each town or one of each type, but of course I wanted one from each town and one of each type because we're collectors and that's what we do. We like to have one of each, but I like the situations where something happened and it was marked again or it was marked off. And here's one where I don't know if you're going to look closely at this. You can see above that 8 marking a black 2, and above that you can see a little bit of a 1. So it was initially struck with Exeter, the town of Exeter, struck it upon receipt that the half-D was to be collected because it was going on to Kirkcaldy and it would go across the toll road. So it was struck there, but it's not very obvious. So in Kirkcaldy, they had the responsibility and took it upon themselves to strike it to make sure that half was collected. So at Kirkcaldy, it would go on for delivery. The recipient would be paying that, and they want to make sure it wasn't missed by the carrier. So there's a little quote I found in the postal regulations, which are terribly clear and very, very wordy. In cases where the Scottish tax, it should say mark, is indistinct, the officers must strike a fresh one, and no excuses can be admitted for sending out Scotch letters other than well and clearly stamped. So there you have it. And please think about how much work went into all of this marking to collect this halfpenny, but the halfpenny was not an insignificant amount of money. And it was not insignificant when they were trying very much to repay the amount that they had put out to these the tollway, the road owners. Yep, let me use that backspace again. Okay, so here's one. So I said, let's make sure we collect the tax for sure. This one is struck 3 times. It's got a manuscript marking. You don't see a lot of the manuscript markings, but you see them. 1 shilling, 2.5 is manuscript right up there in the upper right there. Then I've got a little blow up of it. You can see a faint half D marking and a London, Edinburgh, regular, normal boxed half marking. This is later on, you can tell by the markings being smaller. I think you've got an 1829 in there on an indication. Yeah, 1829 on the red date stamp up there. And there you have 3 times some postal worker had to consider that tax mark, and it is on there 3 times. I love covers like this. They definitely tell a story. So what about exemptions from the tax? So I said if it went on the toll road going into Scotland, it's going to be on a toll road, you've got to pay the tax. But what about mail that gets into Scotland that does not have to go on a toll road and is exempt from the tax? It's exempt if it didn't have to go on the toll road in a mail coach. So you've got cross-border mail that was carried without the use of toll roads. These are border towns, and there's a lot of them. You have foot post and horse post, and what's called a 2-wheeled gig, if you can kind of picture that. Those didn't have a toll charge because they weren't the kinds of vehicles that were damaging the road, so they didn't have to participate in this. So mail that did go by foot post, horse post, or 2-wheeled gig, whether on the toll road or not, but not in a mail coach, there's no wheel tax, no mail tax for that. A big point in this discussion that I just brought up is the mail carriage reverted to horse post during this time to get away from the mail tax and for some other reasons. But some of the early mail that was for sure going on the toll roads started coming off on the toll roads by mail coach, started coming off of that and going by horse post. Mail carried by steamer, of course, isn't on the toll roads. Newspapers, which is really kind of a sore subject because they were actually the weight and the bulk that was on those mail coaches. Soldiers' penny letters, which would be sort of like our official mail, they could be carried by any means, including a mail coach. We're not subject to that charge. A letter coming from a soldier was getting in for a penny as cheaply and effectively as possible to the recipient. Local penny post wasn't on the mail. Local penny post is on for such a short hop, but that's in-town mail. Whether it was on the mail coach or not, it was not subject to it, and it was penny post, so it would have been a 50% upcharge if they included it. And then, of course, any kind of free frank mail was exempt. I'm getting some use of that backspace there. So here's a newspaper. I mentioned that they are kind of big and heavy. So this one cost 4 pence to send because it was 1 pence per ounce, and it was over that. So this is a 4 times rate, but no additional mail tax. This was a contentious issue, but they were exempt. Here's a nice little penny post letter. You see the 1, you don't see a half. They were not subject to the mail tax. And here's a fun topic. So here's a little cautionary tale about rarity that I wanted to share with you. When you get into Macaulay, and I know a lot of us are into it, a lot of times it's about the quality of the strike, what the strike is on, and the earliest known and latest known uses. So I put in this bullet point that says earliest known use and latest known use until they aren't. We're all collecting at all different times. We're all tabulating what we think. We're using different manuals to look these things up. And earliest and latest known uses, they change because somebody finds something else, a new book comes out, that kind of thing. Another thing about markophily is the subtle differences in markings. Are they states of wear? Are they the way it was struck? Are they the surface it was struck on? The more you can know about these things and think about them and just look at the cover and think about it. You know, what is that device made of? Is it brass, cork, rubber? Did it wear? When was it first out and should it be worn? How many devices would there have been? You can kind of get to know the size of the town and how many devices is often known. How big the post office was, the number of employees. You can get a sense of how long that particular marking may have been in use. But I do think that looking at the surface letter and its paper type and condition and how flat it is can get you a long way in understanding why your strike looks like it looks. And I think it's worth thinking through. So the reason I said cautionary tale about the earliest and the latest known uses. So I put together a nice little 5-frame exhibit on my favorite little topic, this halfpenny mail tax. And I used this beautiful little blue brochure here as my guide. And this beautiful little blue brochure has around 40 pages in it. And it was my little Bible, very dog-eared. After my exhibit was done and out a few times, a fabulous book came out and I got it in my hot hands, and it has 375 pages. And these authors did an awesome job. And the book is fantastic in every way possible. It is the dream come true Bible for this halfpenny mail tax. And I was in heaven when I got it in my hot hands. I also went through my exhibit, and I had a lot of earliest and latest known uses because I've been scaring up this material and I had some great stuff. Well, I am here to tell you that all but one of my earliest and latest known uses was blown out of the water when this new book came out. So that is my cautionary tale. And you know what? It didn't matter to me at all. I redid my exhibit very easily and quickly, taking out that reference because I had an irritating feeling that that wasn't what was important. What was important was to tell the story of this mail tax, why it was used, why it wasn't used, and to point out the difficulty and the peculiar situations, you know. And one of the ones I said, like a favorite cover of mine, was the one where they had to strike the half 3 times, you know, 1 manuscript and 2 strikes to make sure they collected the darn thing. So it got into what is your importance and what is the story you're trying to tell. And earliest and latest known uses, you can kind of think them through, you know, by the size of the town, where it physically was, when would they've gotten the marking, when would they replaced it and gotten onto a new type, and just think it through. But falling in love with earliest and latest known uses, just beware of that, because those are always going to change. And I think as we go forward in time, we'll have nice, tidy little databases, and we'll be needing to check this stuff all the time. Yeah. Okay, rarity. So what is rare? With anything, but is it an expensive cover? Is it, you know, is this strike on a nifty cover from Cape of Good Hope, or is it on a nifty cover from London? What's the date use of the marking, the clarity of the strike, unusual use or error, marking type? You know, some of those are very scarce that I have indicated in this the 375 page book. Some of them are very scarce. They're tiny little towns. They didn't use their markings for long. They changed markings up, and you know, were used. There are some true scarcities in this. Is it the destination of the cover? And what I was saying before is it's items that advance your story, that are really about what you see in the material. I think that's where the rarity is these unique items. Like one of my favorite covers looks terrible, but it's I have a little pair of them. One is this mail going to the same town in the summertime and in the winter. In the summertime, it goes across the mail coach. In the wintertime, it has to go by foot. And so it's not subject to the halfpenny tax. And to have one of each, it's like, ooh, that's just so cool. So these are the kinds of things you can think through when you're looking at these covers, or as it pulls out in this markophily story. Okay, we're getting to the end of the little story. So the mail tax was so darn unpopular, but it wasn't all about that. It was really a much bigger story that was going on, which wasn't the mail tax. That was just an irritating, unpopular thing. What was really horrible was how much the mail cost to send altogether. And like I said, it was generally around $1 for any letter going from London to a town in Scotland. A few were less, but more than a shilling was not uncommon at all. To get it up to Edinburgh and on. And most mail went that way, kind of like here FedEx goes through Memphis. A lot of the Scottish mail went up to Edinburgh and out. And it was just very expensive, much clamoring, and a lot of the clamoring that we associate with the push for penny postage was Scottish, because those folks were punished all the more than the people in England. So here we come, November 21st, 1839, we get to 4 pence. And here is a cover of right there, December 5th, 1839, the new rate's effective. Here's a cover showing that for the hand stamp 4, so they're paying 4, and you do not see the half D mark anymore because it does not apply. Once they get to the new rate, the additional half penny tax was abolished. Yay, 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 kind of lost to the record books because we were thinking about the high rates of postage, but we also got rid of this irritating mail tax. And I'm sure the postal clerks that were having to strike everything with that half D mark, they were happy twice as much because their rating got so simplified and they got rid of this annoying tax. And then, you know what's going to happen next is we're going to drop down. But I wanted to just look back on the tax and say a couple of things. One is that the post office, with all that effort, managed to collect far less than it paid for the use of the toll roads. So the whole thing, it offset a financial drain they had, but it didn't collect enough. It created an inefficiency for those poor clerks handling the mail and collecting on payment. It was problematic in that it's, slathering another marking across the mail, what it's already, written on with the rate markings, further obscuring the addressee information that people would like to see, and the date stamps, which became increasingly important because of postal accountability to say, when did it pass from this place to this place? And this just degraded the mail service. The mail carriages were unpopular. They were damaging the roads, and the horse posts were used to get around the tax, and they were used in some cases because the roads were in such bad shape. The whole thing was just not great. What would have been much better was to have had a governmental investment in the infrastructure. I know we always end up talking about infrastructure, but it would have been much better to get those roads in good shape, recognizing the amount of mail traffic that was going to be going on them, as well as all the rest of the traffic going on those roads, get them fixed up and carry the mail more readily, more efficiently and effectively, and at lower rates. And of course, that's exactly where we went. We made the leap of faith, I guess you could say, to drop it down to the penny post rate and get rid of these taxes and these burdens. And it helped the economy, it helped communications, it changed everything. And you know what happened next? Uniform 1 penny post, January 10th, 1840, repealed the uniform rate of 4 pence. For mail to be eligible for the new rate, prepayment was required. Think of how much that really, really fixed everything up. Once it was available in Scotland, we got the 1 penny, the 2 penny, and the 1D letter sheets were in use kind of right away. And look at that, a pretty example. And you know why it's so pretty? It's so pretty because it has my initials, KJ. All right.
That was great. Kathy, before you take it down, that was
Yes.
one. We do remember we said, well, what happens if we get a question that refers to something?
Yeah.
The new Frederick Lawrence wanted to know the newspaper that you showed
Yes.
had a 4D and has a red 1 penny hand stamp. So
It isn't a 1 penny hand stamp. It's a 4 penny hand stamp.
okay,
That little scan shows a 1 penny. You want me to try and get back there?
you want to do that? And I'm going to just.
We'll
That
see
was
if I can
fantastic.
do it.
I thank you. I'm going to start
Okay.
bringing people over.
There's the little scan from a catalog, 1 penny post circular newspaper. But the one that's on that paper right there, if you look at it, it says 4. So that one's a 4 pence. I'm back.
Well, thank you. That was.
Thank you.
Start bringing some of the people over, but before I do, I just wanted to remind everyone out there that Richard Maisel, the founder of our group, he passed, and his family is having a virtual Shiva for him on October 17th. If anyone is interested in that, please do shoot me an email. But I would like to, if you don't mind, Kathy, dedicate this program in his honor. As most of you know, he did put together a presentation, but unfortunately he was in the hospital at the time. But if we could dedicate this program to Richard Mazel's memory. He was the founder of the British Empire Study Group, and I really thank him for starting this, and I thank you for giving the presentation, and everyone for attending.
You're so right, Joan. Wonderful man. Wonderful, wonderful man.
So I'm going to start bringing some people over, and they could ask you questions directly. But as we do, we could ask some of the questions that are coming up. But do the covers all have the sender's address on them? These, when they send the folded letter sheet.
No. A lot of times there's just internal docketing. There's the address that it's going to, but a return address, it's not full on all the letters. You'll see some, yes, but generally, no, you can't count on that.
So you try to infer it from the content?
Oh, yeah. You'll get it. You'll know the to and from the date stamping and from the letter when you open it up, but usually the date stamping, and sometimes from the rate itself, you'll have to work your way backwards. You're not just looking at the halfpenny marking, you're also looking at the circular date stamps and the kinds of circular date stamps that are on there. Some of them will say the town name, of course.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I found the crown circles. You did crown circles. Also, those are always fun. How about when did the mail in Scotland start going by rail? That's asked by Benjamin.
Oof. I don't think I can give you the right answer, but I'll bet someone on this call can. I don't think it's going to be one answer. Okay. If anyone knows the answer, put your hand up and I'll bring you up right away. But, it's called the wheel tax, you said. Yes. So when you picture a mail coach, they have 4 wheels. So horses in the front, and it's taking this carriage. There's also 2-wheel carriages. Those are called gigs. It's the 4-wheel mail thing. And the reason they're saying wheel is it's that heavy wheel that was rutting the roads. And so they're taxing the wheel. And, a person walking on the road, the person on horseback is not causing the damage that these heavy wheels were causing, because they're narrow and they're rutting things. So that is where the wheel part comes in. So they use this money to actually repair those roads, or? They gave the money back to, if you picture different individuals, own chunks of the road. They own acreage that abuts the road that is given up to become the road, and they're getting paid back. So say the road's 100 miles long and you're chunking it and giving different owners a certain amount. How that was all negotiated was the Turnpike trustees that I mentioned. So you can just picture a whole big old wrangling to come up with this program to establish the rate that was going to be reimbursed to pay these guys through. So if anyone has any questions, feel free. Those of you who are already over here, I see a lot of friends. And feel free to unmute and say hello.
Kathy, this is Dan Walker.
Dan Walker.
How many wheel tax covers do you have, approximately?
Dan Walker. I have most of these because I started collecting it because of you. And I would not be exaggerating to say 2,000.
Wow.
It could be more than that, because you know how we collectors are. And you just end up, if one's good, two's better, and you never want to let one go, because sometimes you don't fully understand something. And so something that looks like, I kind of have that already, becomes more interesting later. But then we're collectors and we like the collecting part more than the giving it up part.
Right.
But what's kind of nice about these is a lot of these covers, they aren't outwardly expensive. They're pre-stamped mail. They're interesting, but they're a little ugly at the same time. I think the covers that are a little hard to explain and have just a lot of ink all over them are less appealing to some collectors, but when they tell a story, there's something intriguing about them. You don't want to say no.
Kathy, it's Bill Shan from the UK.
Hello.
It was a great presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was nice seeing the perspective from an American point of view.
Thank you. Oh, looks like we've got an answer there. First mail by rail in the British Isles was from Liverpool. And it went down. I didn't get to read the end of it, but the answer to the
Liverpool
rail.
to Manchester. Liverpool to or Manchester to Liverpool.
Great.
1825.
Hey,
I don't
Kath, this is Chris from Costa Rica. I just got a question. I mean, in this day and age with stamps and so on, you can keep track of the revenue generated, but how on earth did they keep track of basically somebody just stamping a cover or somebody just collecting a halfpenny when it was delivered? How on earth did they manage to keep track of all the monies coming and going?
They weren't keeping track of just that halfpenny getting collected. They were keeping track of the entire rate of the cover being collected. So they were keeping track. And so if a letter went out and it was marked for 8.5, 8.5's getting brought back into the office. And they were tracking all that. And like I said, that wasn't an insignificant amount.
No, quite. Okay, thanks. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Really
And,
good.
and just realize just how cumbersome all of this was. Like when the clamor was there to get to penny postage, they sure were right. I mean, it was, you know, it's difficult for the rating people, for the marking, for the collecting it, for the recipient to have that money at hand when it's time to get their mail. All of it suggested that this needed to change. The clamoring
Sure.
was right, and the clamoring was for quite a few years. This didn't just like get thought of in 1838. By 1840 we had penny post. 1839 we were at 4 pence. But it took quite a bit of clamoring to make this happen, and a big leap of faith that the mail volume would come to offset the drop in revenue. It all was so desperately needed, and it wasn't like you could email instead, So when you put yourself back there a little bit, it really was helping the engine of the economy grow. Look at this, another answer on the rail, 1848. Keep your eyes on the chat. There's things there.
Do you have do you have a favorite cover? Yeah, well,
Yeah, I do. That one I showed you that had the 3 rate markings. And I can't even say that is all that uncommon of a scenario. It just took me a while to decide that the sloppy, ugly, weird mail was exactly what I liked. The ones where you had to look at it and say, what the heck happened? And, these ones that I was describing about that situation with in the winter, it goes this way. And in the weather where you can go across the road, it goes that way. That's what I like. I think for a lot of people that collect the Scottish mail, if it went way up, way up north, those are the best. And those are challenging. The effort that went to carry that mail, the idea that this stuff was, foot post carried is crazy. I collected salons, really what I've collected. And so much of that mail was carried by runners through a different kind of horribleness, through, scary rainforests and everything. But this Scottish mail, the effort it's what's really stellar.
Kathy, that's an interesting point because it's not just the accounting, but the actual carriage
Yes.
that is so complicated. Penny post simplified the accounting. Nothing, as far as I can think, nothing big internationally changed after the penny post until you get to the GPU in 1874. But the carriage itself didn't get simplified all that much, did it?
No.
With the penny-
Well, everything's the Industrial Revolution brought 1,000 changes, but the roads are getting better. the rails coming along, all of these things got better, but that whole business of unpaid mail, that's ugly.
Hello, it's David Beach here in London.
Hello.
The newspaper you showed, my understanding is that the red marking is in fact a tax stamp and not a postage stamp.
Yes.
It's exactly the same as the British tried to impose upon the American colonies in 1765. It's a tax on a newspaper or a pamphlet or something like that. I think the other factor about Scottish roads, and you quite rightly described them as being in poor condition, is of course that the population of Scotland compared with the population of England is comparatively small, and the distances between places is comparatively large.
Yes.
So if you were sending a letter from, say, Edinburgh to Fort William or the north of Scotland, you've got very considerable distances to go in a part of the country that does have a lot of rain and therefore poor roads, before the introduction of surface roads by macadam, which starts to come into the sort of thing. The big game changer really here is the introduction of the railways, as you so correctly point out.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought up more about the newspaper and the taxing and all that. Let's say too, you don't have the mail tax on it, but just look at what that means, that something as simple and every day as to have easy access to a newspaper and all of the communication that was so important in that was punitive too. I get back to this just because of the average working person having a half pence spare at the end of the week kind of thing. It's all just tough. It's tough going, and it's a lot tough going, because what we're talking about, the climate, the distance, the nature of the roadways, the soils, the whole thing. It's just some hilly, difficult land with not the population, and it's tough. And the postal story that's behind all of this is key to the whole industrial, revolution, because that is how communication went. We just have it so good these days with our little emails and, and our Zoom calls, but it wasn't so. Is there anything else?
Can I just say a wee word about the roads in Scotland? Because the roads in Scotland were actually improved by a gentleman called General Wade after the 1715 and 1745 rebellions against the Jacobite rebellions. And these military roads were actually put in place to improve communications in Scotland. So although the public roads may have been in a bad state, there were very good military roads to allow the military to move around Scotland very quickly to quell any rebellions.
Wonderful history.
So why didn't the military roads get used? Was it because
they were using the military roads as well? I believe Bill Shand. I believe the wage roads were used by the civilian traffic as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, they were used. I think David still uses them.
Yeah, and a lot of the roads in Scotland now follow the routes that were laid down by General Wade.
Yeah.
So they weren't all just rutways. They were very good. They were probably as good as the Roman roads.
A quick question on that paper tax again. Is there a brief answer as to how the newspapers politically pulled off not paying the extra tax when they actually accounted for a lot of the weight and a lot of the traffic?
I'm not going to answer that one with certainty, but my guess would be in that tax that we were just talking about, but I don't know that.
I think if I can just make a comment about government revenue. Today, we tend to think about post offices as being individual corporations, whereas if you go back to this sort of time, certainly, and much more into the beginning of the 20th century, you'll find that the post office was just another government department with a duty of raising taxes. After the Napoleonic Wars, for example, you get very expensive tax rates that had postage rates had not a great deal to do with, in fact, running the mail services, but raising money to fight wars against France. So therefore, you get a great distortion, and the revenue should be seen across government and not just for providing a service. Sometimes the service paid for itself, and sometimes it didn't. And there was the dilemma and the great step forward in 1839, 1840.
Kathy,
Michael, oh, sorry, Michael, you had a question also?
well, a comment, and to my dear friend Kathy.
Hey, so
Hey,
nice
kiddo.
to see you.
I'm sure David in London will agree with me, but as an Englishman, I find it very difficult to hear people talk about halfpennies. It's halfpenny. Nobody says halfpenny. It's a halfpenny. Apart from that, Kathy, a great talk. Really enjoyed it.
You can
Look
tell I'm
forward-
sitting here in the middle of corn and soybeans. You know,
Oh,
it's sounds
well,
right
yeah,
from Iowa
right.
when I'm talking, huh?
Oh, well, we've got a
Did anyone
sunny
have-
day here. The mountain in the background isn't quite covered with snow yet, but it's getting close. Take care, everyone.
Was anybody ever offended by seeing the stamp that says North Britain?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know.
I should think some Scottish nationalists would take exception to it.
They did.
Most
Strange,
Scots take
actually.
exception to it.
It's strange, actually, that North Britain was very popular as an address, but occasionally you get letters from Scotland addressed to South Britain, but it is only very occasional.
I believe it. I'm sorry. I believe it came in after the Acts of Union, because technically at that stage it was called the Kingdom of Great Britain. So English people started calling Scotland North Britain, and as you say, some Scots sort of retaliated by calling it England South Britain, but that quite never took off. But I think a lot of Scots were very annoyed about that.
The name was introduced after the unification of Scotland and England in the early 1700s.
Yeah,
That's when the Act of Union was.
1707.
Yeah,
Scottish Act of
1707.
Union, the Scottish and British and English Act of Union. There was no name for the full country, and they went back to the old Roman name, Britannia. So they called the island Greater Britain. So that was where the name Great Britain come from. And if you look at the English flag, was in the Union Jack dates from the same time. Getting back to the government and tax, the first line of the 1711 Post Office Act specifically states that the revenue from the post office was to help fight Queen Anne's, I think it was the War of Spanish Succession. The very first line, second line states that the revenue from the post office was to help fight that war.
Anybody else have anything?
Hi, Kathy. David Drake in England.
Hello, David.
I really enjoyed that presentation because I have my own presentation of ADHARs, which I've shown to a couple of local philatelic societies. And I think you've given me an idea, a better idea as to how to show it to non-specialist collectors.
Yes, yes.
That's,
Not understood. Yeah.
You know, that's something I have failed to do so far, but maybe I will make a better fist of it going forward.
Oh, thank you.
Now that we're moving, you know, we're moving out of COVID and we're meeting again.
Yes, exactly.
I love your fourpenny, first day cover of the fourpenny. I thought that was a lovely thing. I would question you showed an Exeter half.
Yes.
It's on the cover to Kirkcaldy. And the rate mark is 8p.
Right. Is it incorrect?
Well, Exeter is in the southwest of England. So mail from Exeter to get to Scotland would go via London.
Oh, so
And
you're saying that
it's a shilling from London to Scotland.
Right.
So I think that half has to be applied actually in Scotland rather than in Exeter.
You know, and you're probably exactly right. There was a number of covers that, you know, when you start in on this stuff, you match the marking, and then you look at a map, and then you make sense of it, but sometimes you're wrong. And I think that might be the exact kind of cover I need to go back to. It was interesting how when I first started this, I really thought it was about Markopoly. And as I got going on it, I thought, no, this is about maps. You know, and I think you're exactly right. That's probably one that I had down as one thing. And that, you know, when these things are for sale on eBay, it's funny because, you know, the devices, they're going to turn up in many different post offices, and they're going to be very similar, or they could be the same device. And when there's a listing on eBay, it's, you know, just as likely to be right as it is wrong. And it's more likely that some marking is going to be struck in London or in Edinburgh than anywhere else. But yeah, so if I had one that's in there that's wrong, that's just how I started, with a whole bunch of them that were wrong that I was slowly correcting. And then it's probably one that's still wrong. So, you know, I appreciate that. And that's exactly, you know, it's funny because rather than being like, oh, I can't believe I made a mistake. That's what I like about this stuff. It challenges you. And maybe that's an easy one for you, not an easy one for me, you know, but, you know, I said you have to have your manual out and your map out. And that's a perfect example of that. So I'll take a look at that one and make sure I get that one spit up. And
if I could just interrupt, Kathy, Ian Marshall from the UK. David, your comment about everything passing through London, I'm not sure is technically correct. There was quite a West Coast sort of route as well, which is why there's a lot of Carlisle markings. So it may well be that, you know, Exeter took it up through Carlisle, right, and not necessarily through London.
There are a lot of Carlisles. You're absolutely right about that. And yeah, it's interesting. When I organized the exhibit, I had to, I think I ended up having to ask Michael Dixon how to organize those cities as I went, to run them north-south or south-north. It was very interesting. So that's all part of it. And that's what makes all this stuff so great. It's so interesting.
Can I go back to the use of North Britain? At a collectors club meeting about 6 months ago, I think I saw the ultimate use of North Britain, because on one of the covers that one of the exhibitors was showing, it said North Britain, England.
Ooh.
Ooh. Ouch. And that was on the collectors club meeting.
Okay. Evan, you have a question.
Yes, I was wondering, and this could easily go to any of the people on the eastern side of the pond, but would it have been quicker if they had sent mail by ship from London to Edinburgh? Going up the coast?
It was actually a very good question. And
one thing that we've really been quite surprised about, I'm from Aberdeen and I collect Aberdeen, and you'll get covers that will go to London at a much higher rate, where it would only have cost eightpence ship letter rate from Aberdeen to London. And Aberdonians have a reputation of being careful with their money. And so it's quite unusual that you very rarely see any of these covers. The going by road seems to be the more popular route. Why? Don't know. Maybe it's the availability of ships or the reliability of ships in those days. But yeah, that's very true.
Sale, I don't think Sale was reliable. You didn't really have steam on the coasts until nearly 1830, not quite 1830, but Sale was very, very unreliable. So you're much quicker sending, you're much more sure for it to arrive by mail coach than by ship.
quite right that, because most of the mail that went down from Scotland to London by ship went by coastal steamer, which was in the 1830s.
So it was essentially, you paid a little more to go by the coach as compared to taking the risk by going by sea. Okay.
And if I might just add, the coach was a remarkably speedy beast. I have an interesting timetable. People must have had bladders that were made of cast iron because they basically had to spend time on a coach that would have been quite painful, sort of 4 hours between changes of horses and things. But it took a lot less than 48 hours to get up to way beyond, up to Inverness. Now that's going some. Not the time that a boat could take longer.
You get the good date stamps of the transit. The kind of postal accountability that came along with the letters was extraordinary. And yes, it was a good and reliable service. And as far as the ship, I don't think you would have the certainty of its departure. You know, it would be at the dock, but you wouldn't have the certainty of its departure.
On the rails, how far into establishing the rails did you get improvements on the actual rail so that you didn't have? I think there was this kind of this steel would actually pop up and through the car. You know, there was Charles Dickens was involved, a train wreck because the rail heat, the heat coefficient made the rail just curve up into the car. They were just not safe. I think they really had to improve on the steel.
Can I comment there that the railway accident that affected Charles Dickens was in Kent, my part of England, and it was because they took the rail up and misjudged the steamers going to France and got the timetable wrong, and they took the rail up and didn't know there was a train coming, and the train didn't know the rail was up, and it crashed, and it affected Dickens for the rest of his life in a fairly profound way, and we never recovered from it.
Hey, just getting. I asked some workmen laying down continuous rail for the subway system, and that was one of the things that was happened is that the heat coefficient of the old rails was such that the weather could make them pop off the line. I'm just wondering, rails was reliable, but in 1840 they weren't that very reliable.
I think a bigger danger, if I may, is to do with the lack of signalling. Trains were sent away at time intervals, and the block system where you have an exclusive piece of track just for one train was yet to come in. So pioneering has its problems, and that was one of it. I think the metal of the track was fairly stable for the time. Obviously, metal technology continued, but of course you didn't have any welded track. They were all joints, and that's where you get the clickety clank of you used to have. You don't get it now, but those were the expansion elements of it, and so that made it safer.
Okay.
And you'd think we were all just stamp collectors. Look at all these topics we get into.
Yeah.
When the UK went with the continuous rail, they didn't have a straight cut across it. The two rails would slide across each other. The rails were at the actual junction, where the two rails had a point, where the two rails came together. The cuts is at an angle to allow the expansion.
Any collectors of railway mail in Scotland?
Yeah.
Wow.
Strangely enough, the East Coast main line from Newcastle to Edinburgh, that opened to carry mail, and the mail coaches finished within 4 days of that line opening. But then it closed again when they had problems with the track after a storm, but that wasn't anything to do with the actual metal lines themselves. It was the embankments that gave way because of the weight after the weather. So that was soon fixed.
The reason I asked is that when you also talk about Macomber, or the real innovation in roads that actually, I think the composition of the asphalt, it was like the first step towards the kind of asphalt we have now. And that was about, and that was in terms of the durability of the road with heavy traffic over it. And well, potholes still happen, but they didn't happen as much with his innovation. And I just think within transportation, I'm just curious about how the transportation, the technology, the safety of it, I mean, how that progressed in effect and sped up and affected deliveries.
Well, obviously, he was never in the Midwest of the United States through a winter.
Well, the surface of the roads, of course, was called Tar Macadam, and Macadam, of course, is a Scottish name, and that just brings the whole point about the importance of improving the roads in Scotland.
They must have been pretty mucky.
Kathy, just a quick question. I'm not sure if I'm muted or not, but anyway, can you hear me?
You're there. Yep.
Yeah. What about the carrying of valuables? Was, pound notes buried in these sort of letters? Was there any sort of bonds and certificates and other type of valuable goods posted at that time and carried around the country? Do you know at all?
In the early days, for sure, before we even got into this, it was, the mail wasn't for the general people, and it wasn't for all the official mail. The government mail certainly was carrying the valuables. So yes, maybe somebody else can speak to it better than that, but yes, that was a part of the mail too.
I was just wondering if the postage rate varied depending on if there was any or not.
Oh, you know what? I think if I answered that, I'd answer it wrong. Maybe somebody else could do a better job on that. I know that, by distance, by page, that kind of thing, but
yeah,
as far as the valuables in there and that, I don't want to misspeak.
In England, I believe money letters had to be registered, so they were more expensive, obviously, to send.
There was no registration in England until 1841. Before that, the post office recommended that notes be torn in half. You'll often see letters written on the outside of letters, in Ireland anyway, you will see letters half notes. And so you tore your note in half, you posted off the first half. When a letter came back saying that the first half had arrived, the second half was sent. So the post office was getting three letters.
Wow.
Making money.
That's tremendous.
And even
wow.
the post office directories of the time, some of them, you see some of them here behind me, they all recommend that notes be torn in half. England didn't have a registration system until 1841. There was a registration system in the independent Irish post office from, I think it was the very early 1800s up until 1831. And then that registration system was scrapped. But there was no cost on that registration system. There was a special hand stamp to go with it, registered mail. As for valuables, watches and things like that, a lot of the inquiries into the Irish Post Office were complaints about that kind of stuff disappearing in the mail, coin in particular.
Off topic, but I had a question about postal money orders. When did they come in, and did the way they work, was it such that if the postal money, if you, the sender, had your original copy, and it would then what was sent in the mail was stolen, that you could go to the post, that the post office would, as long as it was reported, that you could, whoever you were sending it to could get their money, as long as you could prove that you had the original copy, that you had sent that you were sending to this person.
Yeah, you see in Ireland a lot of the reward posters, and they are in the paper. You will see a list of money that has been stolen, will say in a mail coach robbery, and the numbers of the half notes will be listed in the advertisement or in the reward note, the advertisement as such, again in the Irish papers.
I was thinking more about if I send a postal money order, there's a lot of extra copies in that copy and a lot of flimsies. And did the original ones give you the security that you could send your 10 shillings to your aunt, and if it got stolen, so long as you could prove you sent your 10 shillings to your aunt, she would get the 10 shillings, and whoever took the money, well, the post office dealt with them.
I don't know about that now, to be honest.
Can I small comment on that? There was a money order office from 1792. It was a private arrangement run by some of the senior post office staff, and they got free postage for the letters of advice. The way it worked was that it was you didn't really send a money order as such. You bought it at a post office, and they would send it over to the next post office where it would be paid. So yes, you could then get them if it went astray in the mails, then they would just send another advice. But there was a limit of £5 or 5 guineas on what you could send at a time because of the legal basis in which it was set up. There was also a system of what was called money letters, which was allegedly supposedly for letters that had gold, silver coins in them. One thing you could do if you wanted to send money in banknotes, or drafts or whatever, you put the money in a letter and you also put a sixpence in there. So it would technically be a letter with a silver coin in it. So you do sometimes see letters like that. We say, I am sending you a check for whatever. Please ignore this sixpence. It's just to make the thing more secure. That was a sort of quasi-registration. It wasn't. It was just the post office covering its rear end in case things got lost. It wasn't something you could demand, and it wasn't actually charged for. And it was scrapped when the penny post came.
I thought money letters were always at least double rate because there was an extra item inside the sheet.
That was, I mean, yes, because of the way the charges worked, yes, they were always double rate or higher. So that was, in a way, that paid for itself. But if you were sending a guinea anyway, it would be double rate whether you saw it as a money letter or not. So it was worth telling the postal official that this has got money in it, please enter it in your book, and that it would get written on the letter bill to make sure it didn't get lost. And eventually they had wrappers that the letters would go in towards the end of that period. But it was all a bit ad hoc. So
okay. Because I'm just wondering, the Industrial Revolution and people moving around, if it wasn't a lot, you weren't sending a lot of money to your relatives. How did you send it in a way that you made sure they got it? I mean, you're not sending a guinea. A guinea is a lot of money then, but you're just sending something, a much smaller amount, but it's still important to you to get it, to make sure that your relatives get it.
It did depend on what you're doing. I mean, apparently, like labourers who were building the railways would sometimes literally stuff in a bunch of coins into a letter, and they would often fall out. There was some places had I think Liverpool had special money order forms for Irish labourers to fill in and send money back to their families in Ireland. But generally, that was all you could do. You could stick the money in it wouldn't even be an envelope at that time. It would just put it wrapped in a piece of paper, the letter, seal it as best you could, and hope it would get through. If you declared it as a money letter, that would help. And if the post office noticed that it was full of coins, they would note it as a money letter anyway. But depending on the place, a lot of letters went missing. I mean, that was one of the reasons for the Irish registration systems. Basically, is apparently the way the old Dublin post office was set up, it was full of little dark corners, and it was incredibly easy to slip for the clerk to slip a valuable letter in their pocket. So they introduced this anything a double letter or larger would be registered, and the post office solicitors' charges for looking into this went down from about £400 per annum to like £5 per annum. So it was quite effective.
Well, that sounds like a whole different topic.
So, you do sometimes see cash going a long way. I mean, I've got one from Glasgow down to Torquay, which is a money letter, where they were sending £150, and there would be no other way to. It's got an additional half on as well, obviously, just to bring it back to the topic. Okay. There would be no other easy way to do it than by sending it by the post office at that time.
Well,
I'm sorry to get us in that, but I was thinking about how much money moves by between very poor people, relatively poor immigrants from down to Mexico. I mean, a lot of money moves now through Western Union and through other wiring the money. And in the mid-19th century, people were moving far away from home, and I'm wondering, did the post office play a role in them being able to move their money back home, and before there were checks in the Western Union?
Well, I think we should find someone to really talk about that topic, because I think that's a really good cultural and a place where we could really use postal history in this. I think I see Kenya. Ken, you're doing a talk next month on counterfeit currency and propaganda currency, which, if you're interested in that type of thing, it should be really interesting. But
I can confirm that now. I have to get the information to you, but it is on.
Terrific. And it's totally sending money with all the postal markings. I found that really fascinating, Kathy, because sometimes I look at those squiggles and you're like, it looked like they don't really look like they're real writing, but they actually did mean something.
Yes. And your first thought could be that there's a lot of mistakes being made, but no, it's rewriting as it goes from point to point, which is just so interesting.
Yeah. And I found that really fascinating. When I first met Keith, he told me to collect stamp lists, because stamp lists were the, I guess, most economical way to get his wife to collect something. So, but now today, 20 years later, he's regretting that decision. I think he wants me to go collect first day covers now.
Go collect first day covers.
Thank you for the presentation. It was one of the best that I've heard in a while. You must be. I'm thinking you do this for a living on your day-to-day, on your pay job.
Oh, absolutely not. I just recently got Wi-Fi. I had such unreliable service out here. Joan had asked me to give a talk earlier, and I've given talks at stamp clubs. I love it. I love it. I love going to a stamp club and talking about our hobby, or talking, with a, group of historians or something like that. But my Wi-Fi was terrible here, just would freeze up, and I just have to be on, on sound only. So finally I got the Wi-Fi out here in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, so no, I haven't been doing this at all. And Joan had to give me a very, very basic tutorial. I'm humbled by what I did not know. Which includes that I didn't have Office on my laptop.
Hey, but we got by. We got by.
We got by. We got by.
And I learned that my computer doesn't like casting and share all at the same time. So,
we all learn.
But well, do we have any more questions? I know it's late for some of us in England, for some of you in England and Scotland.
I appreciate everybody coming in, especially with the time zones. It's very nice to be able to give a talk like this and have such participation on, a nit in a small time in history.
And Gary, I like your topic as using the post office as the original banking system. That might make a very interesting talk. So I have to relate it to British Empire, I guess, because it came from Britain.
Because it has to be.
Has to be British. Everything's British.
Everything's British.
Well, actually, Terry Hines has done some wonderful work in taking post office logs of money orders, New England, and tracking their use as the local banking system, and done an econometric study to show the growth and decline of the economy over time, just based on postal money orders. So there's a lot of material out there about that. I think Terry was one of the first to really explore it from an econometric standpoint. But yeah, it's a really interesting topic.
I would suggest that the original banking system, which is still in use today and has been for centuries, is the Halawa system used in many Arabic countries, particularly in places like Afghanistan, where it's just an honor system, and it's unbelievably efficient.
I know absolutely nothing about it. My husband gets cringes when I touch the checkbook. So that sounds like we'll have to learn more about that. Do you have a good contact for that, Michael?
I'm sorry, only the place where I used to work. Kathy can tell you who that is offline.
Yes, I can.
Kathy and I think Joan recently used the word squiggles to describe these things on the front of the cover. It reached a funny bone for me because I was researching today the trial of probably the first forger being charged with forging stamps and so on. And his name was Giovanni Petroni, an Italian, but he did live in London for a time and then moved to Philadelphia. And it was in Philadelphia where he was charged with this new crime and so on of forging stamps. And he forged the stamps of Nicaragua, a number of British colonies, St. Thomas, Prince, Egypt, Angola, and British Guiana, and so on. But when it came to Egypt, the judge's comments were that he decided that the stamps of Egypt bore certain hieroglyphics which neither he nor the jury could read or successfully could not distinguish the false from the true. That charge was dismissed. It's kind of interesting that. So when you mentioned squiggles on the front of a cover, I could just imagine that this judge probably couldn't have a clue what that was about either.
But this presentation was wonderful, Kathy. I thank you very much, and I thank everyone for attending.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone attending.
Wonderful.
We learned a
Kathy.
lot.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah, I love these presentations that you can learn so much from, and Kathy, you did a wonderful job.
Well, thank you. And
Yeah, I totally enjoyed it.
Good night, and let you be. Goodbye.
I'm very sorry I missed it.
Oh, well, John, it will be recorded, so it's recorded, so we'll see Kathy.
Thanks very much.
Oh, well, thank you. So I guess we'll say goodnight now. Is
All
that-
right.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, good
Bye.
night.
Thank you, Kathy. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Yep, see you next month.